Hey friends, Josh here. So one of the earlier videos here on this channel is called Jesus Was Jewish. In that video, I spent some time talking about the importance of seeing Jesus of Nazareth as a first century Jew. Not just because he lived and ministered during that time period, but because he was Jewish in the full sense of the word. That his teachings, his interpretation of the law and the prophets, his manner of life, and his expectation for the future, all of those things can be placed within the same framework as his fellow descendants of Abraham. Now, if you or I lived back at the time of the first century, we wouldn't have looked at Jesus as if he was just a Christian pastor or a military commander or the ringleader of some freak show circus. He was a Jewish rabbi, and his teachings were similar in many ways to the Pharisees of his day. He prayed in the temple. He celebrated all of the Jewish feasts according to the law. And I made the point back in that first video that if Jesus was Jewish and came to the Jewish people in the land of Israel 2,000 years ago, it's important for us then to read his words and see the events of his life through that specific lens. Now, there's been a lot of scholarship and historical work done on this particular subject over the last number of decades. And I think of scholars and historians like E.P. Saunders and Paula Fredrickson. And they do a great job of exploring Jesus and Paul in life in first century Israel. Of course, the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls has contributed to a major shift in our understanding of that time period too. But I've noticed that while there's a vibrant discussion among academics, the implications of these important historical discoveries don't often make it down decisively to the popular level in such a way that it actually changes the way the average Gentile disciple of Jesus reads the scriptures and lives out their lives. I've seen this firsthand in so many of the folks that I've been around now in my nearly 2 decades of full-time ministry. One of the ways I've seen this is in the way that we understand the original disciples of Jesus, the apostles, the guys like Peter and James and John and Matthew the tax collector. When we read about the 12 in the Gospels, we often assume that they're mostly ignorant, uneducated tradesmen who are just childish and unrefined and therefore unable to grasp the complexities of the spiritual truths that Jesus is teaching them. I'll develop that a little bit more in a minute here. Another difficulty we often encounter in trying to understand the apostles is that we tend to read the Bible anachronistically, meaning we take our lives and our experiences and culture and we superimpose those things onto the Jewish people in first century Israel. And we do this so much really without even realizing it. Now, we can't read our Bibles and assume these guys were Christians, just like modern believers who go to a church on Sunday and maybe a couple of times a month on a Wednesday, go to the midweek service, and then if they were really holy, they would go to the men's breakfast or show up for pre-service prayer. Friends, the apostles were Jewish, and they remain Jewish even after their time with Jesus. Now, what I don't mean is that their religion was Jewish, and I'll discuss more of this in a second. They were raised in a culture with customs and an outlook for the future completely different from the modern world. They were deeply familiar with their scriptures, which not only chronicled their history, but outlined the details of their culture and their lifestyle and set firm expectations for the future. They were the people who had descended from Abraham. They were the family chosen to be the vehicle of blessing to all of the other families of the earth. Their ancestors were the ones who met God at Mount Sinai and entered into the covenant with him. They were the ones to whom the prophets spoke about their capital city, Jerusalem, and how a king from David's line would one day rule from there and bring all of their people back to the land and defeat their enemies once and for all. Now, one of the things that historians and scholars have unpacked for us related to that is the fact that there was no religion in antiquity, at least in the way that we modern folk tend to think about religion. When we think about a religion, maybe what comes to our mind is a coherent system of belief in some kind of ritualistic behavior and maybe some sort of institutionally governed hierarchical leadership structure or something like that, right? For example, in Catholicism, you have the Pope, and then you have bishops, and then you have priests. And whether you're Brazilian or Belizean or Burmese, you can be a Catholic, right? In the modern world, your ethnicity really has nothing to do with your religion. But in antiquity, that was not the case whatsoever. As historian Paula Fredrickson comments, she says, in antiquity, all religions were ethnic and all ethnicities were religious. In other words, in the ancient world at the time of Jesus, your family group and your community, whether that be your city or your nation, was a major determining factor in your cultic practices, the god or the gods that you worshipped. Maybe your city had gods that they worshipped, like in Acts 19 in the city of Ephesus, for example. They worshipped and housed the temple of Artemis. And maybe your family had a long history of ancestral gods they worshiped. Worshiping gods in the ancient world was utilitarian. It was like having an insurance policy. You'd want to make sure that the gods remained happy because happy gods meant happy humans. And if the gods were honored and worshiped, well, then things would go well for your family and your community. And if things were going badly, well, if there was a famine, if there was a nation that was about to invade yours, or your wife couldn't get pregnant or something, you would offer sacrifice to the gods and garner their favor. Again, it was like an insurance policy for them. Now, I say all that because we tend to read the New Testament through a very different lens. We look at the apostles as just random dudes who practiced a religion called Judaism. And then after Jesus came on the scene, well, they became Christians and they stopped going to synagogue on Saturday and they started going to church on Sunday. And maybe they used to think that they would go to heaven if they could just obey the law enough. But because it was just so hard to do, they were just so thankful that Jesus came to free them from their shame and release them from the heavy burden of doing the law. Unfortunately, that's how Jesus and the Jewish apostles of Jesus are often characterized today. But that's really modern and it's pretty flawed. Historian and scholar E.P. Saunders and many others have shown that this is not at all what the ethnic descendants of Abraham believed about the law or expected for the future. And as I've said, in the first century, your ethnicity and the gods you worshipped weren't separate subjects. And when we understand this about Jesus' disciples, we ought to see them not as abandoning their ancestral customs and beliefs and future expectations because of Jesus, but rather firming them up, being more sure of them, and being even more deeply committed to them. Because from day one of meeting Jesus, they believed that Jesus was the Messiah, the Christ. Now, I have another video in the description I've linked down below for you on the topic of Messiah and Christ. But in short, Messiahs weren't ones who died on crosses and atoned for sins. For the disciples of Jesus, they anticipated what Moses and the prophets had spoken about over and over and over again, that God had made a covenant with their people, and because of that covenant, he would restore the 12 tribes of Israel to the land, he would rebuild Jerusalem, he would raise up a son of David as the king over them, and use the people of Israel as his servant to be a light to the rest of the nations. As Jesus' ministry progresses over the next few years, the apostles become even more convinced of that fact. And instead of affirming their expectations, we typically understand them as, again, ignorant, unlearned, unrefined, and unable to grasp the complexities of this new spiritualistic, de-ethnicized eschatology that Jesus was teaching them. And that somehow they needed the Spirit to see that their old nationalist hopes were just garbage now, really, that everything they had known from their childhood had actually been redefined and reimagined. But friends, this is not the case at all. As we can see, after Jesus had risen from the dead, the disciples asked this all-important and all-revealing question in Acts chapter 1, verse 6. Luke says, "So when they had come together, they asked him, 'Lord, will you at this time restore the kingdom to Israel?'" So after hearing Jesus' teachings for several years and after having been taught directly by the Lord for 40 days following his resurrection, they ask, "Lord, well, we know you to be that son of David we've been looking for. Are you going to crush Rome? Are you going to restore Jerusalem and bring back the 12 tribes now, just like we're expecting you to do?" Their question was not an uninformed question. Notice how they're still thinking in a very Jewish way. The burning thing on their mind wasn't about heaven or spiritual gifts or revival or whatever other subjects the Christians often think about. It's about God doing what he said for Israel. Jesus, of course, answers this by saying, I'm not going to tell you when that's going to happen. And throughout his ministry, Jesus hadn't corrected their apocalyptic expectations. He rather affirmed them, hence why they even asked that question in the first place. So the disciples were either exceedingly dull and just completely ignorant at this point, which is, again, what the average modern believer often thinks, or they had actually believed Moses, and they believed the prophets, and they actually believed what Jesus said and taught. These guys were Jewish. Their ancestral practices, their beliefs, their expectations for the future, these were what they were raised with, the context in which they understood Jesus within, and the very things that they looked forward to with eagerness. So why is this important? I mean, Jesus died for me. He loves me. I'm going to be with him forever. So what does it even matter if the apostles were Jewish? Well, as I've said in many of my other videos, what we think about the future changes the way we live in the present. So as it did for the Jewish apostles of Jesus, so must the return of the Messiah, the rebuilding of Jerusalem, the restoration of Israel, the resurrection of the dead, and the blessing to the nations be what we expect as well. If we want to live like they did, we should read and understand the scriptures like they did. As we see in their own writings, they too continued to expect all of these same things. They understood their place in God's grand story, and they expected its soon culmination. That's why they lived with urgency, sobriety, and the fear of the Lord. And I'm so convinced that our personal lives and our interactions with one another and even our missiology would be quite different if we understood the scriptures as they did and we understood our place in God's grand story. Of course, one short video can't undo centuries of Gentile confusion, but I hope it can provoke you a little bit to maybe begin thinking about asking questions about Jesus and the apostles and the Jewish story and what it means for Gentiles in the 21st century. And if anything, I hope you can walk away saying, yeah, there's definitely some details I need to do some digging into. Of course, I've got a large number of videos here on my channel, and I co-host a weekly podcast explaining these things and exploring these things as well. So I hope you can check that out. I'll leave a link in the description below. Well, there's more to come, so drop a like and leave a comment if this was encouraging and provoking. Until next time, God bless and Maranatha.